My parents disowned me 9 years ago because I refused to marry the wealthy man they had chosen for me. Instead, I chose Terrence, a brilliant but struggling single father who was trying to build a technology startup from his tiny garage. My parents, who considered themselves the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta society, erased me from their lives. They treated my new family as though we were a literal disease. But tonight was supposed to be our ultimate triumph. My husband had just taken his data analytics software company public on the New York Stock Exchange. The initial public offering was a staggering success, pushing his personal net worth to exactly $44 million. To celebrate this massive victory, we booked the most exclusive private dining room in Buckhead, a place where dinner reservations were guarded like highly classified state secrets. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the long mahogany table. Terrence sat across from me, his handsome face glowing with a beautiful mixture of pure exhaustion and profound relief. Next to him sat his 14-year-old daughter Aaliyah, happily looking over the menu and trying to decide between the lobster and the Wagyu steak. For the first time in nearly a full decade, my heart felt completely whole and entirely at peace. I was Simone, 33 years old, a successful forensic accountant, and the deeply proud wife of a man who had built a massive corporate empire from absolute scratch. We finally felt untouchable. The feeling of being untouchable was not just born from the sudden influx of Wall Street capital. It was the deeply satisfying result of a meticulous surgical trap we had set exactly 3 weeks prior. I still vividly remembered the cold, quiet Tuesday evening when the first domino fell. I had been sitting alone in my corner office on the top floor of my firm, surrounded by towering stacks of financial disclosures regarding the highly publicized Midtown Luxury Tower project. My firm had been hired by a nervous coalition of secondary investors to conduct a routine health check on Chadwick's primary holding company. What started as a standard audit quickly morphed into a horrifying descent into massive corporate fraud. The ledgers were a chaotic, tangled web of phantom shell corporations and highly inflated asset appraisals. I spent 14 hours straight tracing the digital breadcrumbs, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of my dual monitors. When I finally cracked the encrypted routing sequence, the ugly truth stared back at me in bold red numbers. Chadwick was not just failing, he was actively robbing new investors to silence the old ones. But the true shock came when I traced the initial $7 million bailout injection. The source account belonged to a highly restricted employee pension fund directly managed by my father's logistics empire. Carlton had illegally drained his workers' futures to save his arrogant son-in-law. I remember driving home that night in absolute silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel as the sheer magnitude of their incoming destruction washed over me. When I showed Terrence the printed spreadsheets on our kitchen island, he did not panic. He simply looked at the undeniable proof of my father's federal crimes, picked up his phone, and dialed Marcus Vance, his ruthless corporate attorney. Together, we had quietly contacted the FBI task force. We essentially spent the last 3 weeks watching a pair of blind, desperate predators march willingly toward the edge of a massive cliff. Tonight's dinner was never just a celebration of an initial public offering. It was the grand finale of a federal sting operation. Then the heavy oak doors of our private dining suite swung violently open, signaling that our trap had finally been sprung. The restaurant manager stood in the doorway looking frantic and deeply apologetic, but he was forcefully shoved aside by my mother. Vivian stepped right into the center of the room, wearing a tailored emerald green designer suit and an expression of absolute unyielding entitlement. Behind her was my father Carlton, a man whose entire existence revolved around his perceived status in the elite circles of the city. Trailing very closely behind them came my older sister Dominique, the undisputed golden child of our toxic family, and her arrogant white husband Chadwick. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees, becoming suffocatingly cold. Aaliyah stopped reading her menu entirely, her dark eyes darting nervously toward her fiercely protective father. I slowly lowered my glass of sparkling water, my hands trembling not from fear, but from a sudden volcanic surge of pure anger. 9 years of absolute silence, 9 years of missed birthdays, completely ignored holidays, and blatant cruel disrespect, only for them to crash the most important and celebratory night of my entire adult life. Vivian did not bother with a polite greeting. She did not ask how I was doing, nor did she congratulate Terrence on his historic financial achievement on Wall Street. Instead, she marched purposefully and directly to the very head of our long dinner table. She violently slammed a thick brown folder down onto the pristine white tablecloth, knocking over my tall crystal water glass in the process. The freezing liquid spilled across the polished wood, dripping steadily onto my beautiful dress. But my mother did not even blink once. She just looked down at me with the exact same cold, intensely calculating stare that had haunted my entire childhood. I stared right back at her, absolutely refusing to let her see the old buried insecurities she always used to exploit. Terrence immediately reached for a cloth napkin, gently dabbing at the growing spill, while keeping his broad shoulders angled protectively toward his teenage daughter. My father stood near the entrance, crossing his arms and looking around the opulent room, as if he were silently calculating its exact monetary value. Dominique leaned against Chadwick, whispering something cruel into his ear that made him smirk widely. The sheer audacity of their sudden presence was completely suffocating. "What is the actual meaning of this?" I asked, intentionally keeping my voice dangerously low and remarkably steady so that my stepdaughter would not feel any panic. Vivian confidently tapped the thick folder with her perfectly manicured red fingernail. "We are here to handle some overdue family business," she announced loudly, her voice dripping with artificial, unearned authority. "We saw the news about the stock market earlier today. It seems your little charity project finally paid off in a major way." I felt Terrence tense up incredibly tight beside me, but he remained completely silent, patiently waiting for my cue to intervene. "You have a lot of nerve walking into this private room," I told her, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. "You do not ever get to celebrate our success after pretending we simply did not exist for nearly a decade." Vivian let out a loud laugh, a harsh, entirely humorless sound that echoed sharply off the elegant fabric-lined walls. "Celebrate," she mocked openly, waving her hand with a highly dismissive gesture. "We are definitely not here to celebrate your lucky windfall, Simone. We are here right now to firmly collect what is rightfully ours." She opened the brown folder and swiftly pulled out a single crisply printed sheet of thick paper, pushing it forcefully directly into my waiting hands. "This is a comprehensive list of demands," she declared proudly, ensuring that her sharp voice carried clearly over the soft jazz music playing quietly in the background. My eyes rapidly scanned the official-looking document, and my blood immediately ran completely cold. The sheer, unadulterated delusion printed clearly on that page was truly staggering to comprehend. Item 1 demanded $2.5 million to fully pay off the massive mortgage on my parents' lavish country estate. Item 2 demanded a $5 million direct capital injection into Chadwick's failing fraudulent commercial real estate business by tomorrow. The unbelievable arrogance made me grit my teeth. I stared upward into my mother's greedy eyes. Vivian did not flinch. Instead, she slowly turned her head, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows arching as her cold eyes locked onto Aaliyah. My stepdaughter shrank into her chair, pressing her shoulders against the leather upholstery. Vivian let out a theatrical sigh. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her emerald green designer suit shifting stiffly. "I see you are dragging around this extra baggage," Vivian remarked, her voice cutting through the room's ambiance like a jagged shard of glass. "I told you 9 years ago that raising another woman's child would ruin your social standing in Atlanta. You could have married Marcus Dubois and been a federal judge's wife, but you chose to play savior to a man who could barely afford rent, taking on his baggage to spite us." Terrence placed his hand firmly over Aaliyah's trembling fingers. His jaw clenched tight. He was a fiercely protective father, and I knew it was taking every ounce of his immense self-control to remain seated. I placed my hand gently on his knee under the table, giving him a firm squeeze. This was my deeply toxic family, and this particular battle belonged entirely to me. I took a deep breath, pushing aside the frightened little girl I used to be, and embraced the powerful woman I had become. I stood up, my heavy wooden chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. The harsh sound forced everyone to focus entirely on me. I did not shed a single tear or raise my voice. Instead, I let my gaze sweep over my mother from head to toe, allowing a highly dismissive smile to form on my lips. You have an incredible amount of nerve walking into my private dinner and demanding $17 million while wearing a Chanel suit from 4 seasons ago. I said, my voice eerily calm and dripping with absolute venom. Did you really think I would not notice the outdated cut, Mother? The hem is visibly frayed and you had it tailored to fit because you bought it at a luxury consignment shop in Midtown. For a woman claiming to be the queen of Buckhead society, you look desperately broke. Vivian's mouth dropped open in pure shock. The vibrant color drained instantly from her heavily contoured face, leaving her looking old and hollow. My father Carlton stepped forward quickly, his face flushing a deep, dangerous shade of purple. "Simone," Carlton barked, pointing a thick, shaking finger directly at my face. "You will show your mother the respect she deserves right now, or I swear to you, I will make you regret it." "Or you will do what, Carlton?" I interrupted him sharply, dropping the title of father entirely. "Will you cut me off again? Will you ban me from the family estate that currently has 3 different foreclosure notices stapled to the front gates? You cannot threaten someone who holds all the cards." Carlton froze completely, his arm dropping heavily to his side, as if I had physically struck him across the face. I did not stop there. I stepped around the massive table, closing the distance between us, forcing them to look me directly in the eye. "Do you honestly think I do not know exactly what is going on with your precious social lives?" I asked. "I am a forensic accountant. Tracking dirty money is literally what I do for a living. You came in here acting like you own the city, but you did not voluntarily step away from the Piedmont Driving Club last month. You were forcibly escorted off the premises by security." Vivian gasped loudly, taking a sudden step backward until her back hit the heavy oak door. Chadwick, my brother-in-law, shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his arrogant posture faltering as he glanced nervously between me and Carlton. "That is right," I continued, ensuring every word echoed clearly in the silent room. "The great Carlton and Vivian had their prestigious country club membership permanently revoked because your monthly dues bounced 3 consecutive times. You wrote bad checks to the club, to your private chef, and to the landscaping company. The entire board of directors knows you are broke. You are a walking financial hazard, and you thought you could use my husband as an ATM to save your pathetic social standing." The silence following my revelation was absolutely deafening. The grand facade my parents had meticulously built over 40 years was shattering into a million jagged pieces. For 9 years, they had spun a narrative to their wealthy friends, claiming they cut me off because I was a massive disappointment. Now the roles were completely reversed. They were the desperate beggars, and I was the gatekeeper to the only money that could save them from total public humiliation and absolute ruin. Vivian opened her mouth to speak, but she could not form a coherent sentence. Her hands shook violently at her sides. She looked to Carlton for help, but he was staring at the floor, his jaw tight and his eyes darting frantically as he tried to formulate a lie to save his shattered pride. Just as the reality of their defeat began to settle, the sharp clicking of designer heels broke the tension. Dominique, my older sister and the golden child who could never do any wrong, stepped aggressively in front of our parents. She tossed her long weave over her shoulder and glared at me with pure hatred. "How dare you speak to them like that?" Dominique hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic mixture of arrogance and fury. "You have always been a jealous hater. You think because your husband got lucky that you are suddenly better than us. You will never be on my level. You owe this family for everything, and you will show respect." I looked at Dominique, taking in her fake designer handbag and entitled posture. She had just handed me the exact opening I needed, and I was perfectly ready now. Dominique took a bold step forward, her diamond bracelets clinking loudly in the quiet dining room. "You are completely delusional, Simone," she scoffed, waving a perfectly manicured hand in my direction. "You honestly believe a lucky initial public offering makes you equal to us? I am a prominent lifestyle influencer with over 2 million followers. My husband builds the very skyscrapers you look up at every single day. We live in a gated Buckhead estate, and I drive a custom Porsche. You live in a modest suburb and married a man who was coding in a damp basement just 3 years ago. You will never possess the refined elegance that I naturally exude." I let out a slow, deliberate laugh. The sound bounced off the crystal chandeliers, making my sister flinch. "A custom Porsche Dominique?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Is that the exact same white Porsche Macan that was forcibly towed from the valet parking lot at Phipps Plaza last Tuesday afternoon? Because I have a very clear memory of auditing the repossession agency that impounded it." Dominique's jaw snapped shut. Her eyes darted frantically toward her husband, but Chadwick suddenly looked incredibly interested in the intricate pattern of the carpet. "Do not try to lie your way out of this," I continued, taking a step closer to her. "I am a senior forensic accountant for the largest financial oversight firm in the Southeast. My entire career is dedicated to finding the hidden numbers that liars try to bury. When I saw your name pop up in a routine audit of predatory lenders, I did a deep dive into your so-called flawless elite lifestyle." "You are making this up," Dominique hissed, though her voice lacked its usual arrogant sting. "Am I?" I challenged, crossing my arms. "Let us talk about your luxurious influencer trip to Dubai last month. The one you posted 50 pictures of, claiming Chadwick rented a private yacht for your anniversary. My audit trail shows you financed that entire vacation through a high-risk short-term lending company, charging a 400% annual interest rate. You are currently drowning in over $80,000 of unsecured consumer debt just to buy fake followers and rent designer clothes you cannot actually afford." My mother Vivian gasped loudly. "Dominique, what is she talking about? Tell her she is lying." Dominique could not even look at our mother. She stared at the floor, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. The pristine, untouchable golden child facade was rapidly melting away, revealing the desperate, financially ruined fraud hiding underneath. "And that is not all, Mother," I said, refusing to let off the gas. "That beautiful gated Buckhead estate she constantly brags about, they do not own it. They have been renting it month to month, and the landlord filed a formal eviction notice 3 weeks ago because they are completely out of cash. Dominique has been selling off her engagement ring stones and replacing them with cubic zirconia just to keep the lights on." "Shut your mouth!" Dominique screamed, her composure completely shattering. She lunged forward, raising her hand as if to slap me across the face, but Terrence moved faster than lightning. He stepped firmly between us, his tall frame shielding me entirely. He did not say a single word, but his cold, unwavering glare made my sister stop dead in her tracks. She backed away, trembling with absolute humiliation, as the ugly truth of her fake life hung heavily in the air. "You have spent your entire life tearing me down to make yourself feel superior," I said, stepping around my husband to deliver the final blow. "You called me a failure when I went to a state college instead of a private university. You mocked my accounting degree, calling it boring and basic. But my boring degree is exactly what exposed your pathetic, bankrupt existence. You are nothing but a broke, desperate woman pretending to be a wealthy socialite on the internet." The private dining room felt suffocatingly tense. My father Carlton rubbed his temples, clearly horrified by the sudden exposure of his favorite daughter's massive financial failures. Vivian stared at Dominique in sheer disgust, her own social climbing priorities, deeply offended by the idea of payday loans and cubic zirconia. They had placed all their hopes on the golden child, only to find out she was just as financially ruined as they were. This was the exact moment the dynamic shifted. The unified front my toxic family had brought into the restaurant was fracturing rapidly. They were turning on each other, their greed and vanity clashing violently with the harsh reality of their empty bank accounts. But before they could start screaming at one another, a new voice interrupted the chaos. "All right, that is quite enough," Chadwick announced loudly. He stepped forward, pushing past his weeping wife without offering her a single ounce of comfort. Chadwick was a tall, imposing white man who wore his generational wealth like a heavy suit of armor. He had always despised Terrence, viewing my husband's self-made success as a direct threat to his own inherited privilege. Now, with his wife's embarrassing secrets fully exposed, Chadwick clearly felt the urgent need to assert his dominance. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked down his nose at Terrence, his expression dripping with blatant condescension. "You think you have us all figured out because your little wife knows how to read a basic spreadsheet?" Chadwick sneered, adopting a patronizing tone that instantly made my blood boil. "But you need to understand how the real world works, Terrence. You might have stumbled into some new money with your software gimmick, but you do not have the pedigree, the connections, or the actual class to survive in our circles. You are entirely out of your depth. Chadwick took another step forward, entering Terrence's personal space, radiating unearned confidence and racial arrogance. He pointed a long finger directly at my husband's chest. You listen to me very carefully because I am only going to say this once, Chadwick ordered, his voice echoing with the certainty of a man who had never been told no. Your little software company did not magically succeed in a vacuum. You operated in a business ecosystem that my family helped build. When you pitched your startup to investors, you were walking into boardrooms my father established. We created the infrastructure that allowed a guy like you to get a seat at the table. You owe us for that access. Terrence did not swat Chadwick's finger away. He did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. He looked down at the pale hand hovering inches from his suit, then slowly shifted his gaze back up to Chadwick's flushed face. And because of that so-called access, Chadwick continued, oblivious to the dangerous calm radiating from my husband, I am going to need you to wire $5 million into my primary corporate account by tomorrow morning. We can call it a retroactive consulting fee. Consider it a mandatory tax for operating in our territory. You pay that fee, and we will happily let you continue playing the successful tech founder. If you refuse, I will ensure every major investor knows where you came from, and I will make your new stock plummet before the opening bell on Monday. The sheer audacity of his demand hung heavily in the private dining room. He was attempting to extort a newly minted millionaire in a public restaurant, believing his race and his family name granted him complete immunity from any consequences. Terrence gently pulled his chair back and stood up to his full height. At 6'3", my husband was physically imposing, but it was his quiet dignity that completely dwarfed the man standing before him. He buttoned his suit jacket with slow, deliberate movements. A consulting fee, Terrence repeated, his deep voice smooth and perfectly level. You want $5 million for paving the way for my success. Exactly, Chadwick said, puffing out his chest. It is the cost of doing business in our city. Terrence let out a soft, humorless chuckle. Let me refresh your memory about how I actually built my company, Chadwick. 9 years ago, I was raising a 5-year-old daughter completely alone. I was working 3 different contract jobs just to keep the heat on in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment. When I finally had a working prototype of my data analytics software, I took it to 14 different venture capital firms in this city. Terrence took a slow step forward, forcing Chadwick to instinctively take a half step back. Do you want to know what happened in those boardrooms you claim your family built? Terrence asked, his voice hardening into solid steel. They laughed me out of the building. They looked at my zip code, they looked at my skin color, and they decided I was not worth their time. And the one firm that wanted to give me a seed round, the one firm that saw the actual value in my code, they pulled their offer 24 hours before signing. I wonder why that happened. Chadwick swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward my father, Carlton, who was currently staring intensely at the expensive wallpaper. I know exactly why it happened, Terrence stated, refusing to break eye contact with my brother-in-law, because 9 years ago you and Carlton made a series of very strategic phone calls. You used your generational connections to make sure that I was completely blacklisted from every major tech incubator in the Southeast. You tried to starve me out. You tried to make sure that I would fail, so you could prove to Simone that she made a massive mistake by choosing me over your elite society. I watched my husband dismantle the arrogant man before him, my heart swelling with overwhelming pride. Terrence had never once complained about the unfairness of his journey. He had simply outworked every single person who tried to block his path. I did not succeed because of your ecosystem, Terrence declared, his tone ringing with absolute undeniable truth. I succeeded in spite of it. I taught myself advanced machine learning while my daughter slept. I built my initial servers from scrapped parts. I secured my first major contract from a hospital network in Chicago because nobody in Atlanta would even return my emails. I bled for this company, Chadwick. I sacrificed sleep comfort and security to build a $44 million enterprise. You did not pave a single inch of my road. You threw rocks at my feet, and I used those same rocks to build my foundation. Terrence leaned in, slightly lowering his voice, so that only the people in our immediate circle could hear the final crushing blow. So you can take your retroactive consulting fee and your pathetic threats, Terrence whispered coldly. And you can walk right out that door. I do not owe you a single dime, and I am not afraid of your empty promises. Chadwick stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The inherent superiority he had relied on his entire life had just collided with an immovable brick wall of earned excellence. He had no counter-argument. He had no leverage. He only had his own desperate escalating panic. I stepped forward, placing my hand gently on Terrence's strong back. It was time to pull the curtain all the way back. You do not need to explain your hard work to a common criminal, Terrence, I said smoothly, turning my attention entirely to my sweating brother-in-law. He is not asking for $5 million because he thinks he deserves a consulting fee. He is begging for $5 million because if he does not deposit that exact amount into his corporate escrow account by tomorrow afternoon, he is going to federal prison. Chadwick's face lost its arrogant color, turning sickly gray. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the edge of a mahogany serving cart. The crystal glasses rattled loudly, echoing the violent tremor shaking his entire body. Dominique grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with frantic confusion. She looked from her trembling husband to me, completely oblivious to the massive financial crater opening beneath her designer heels. "What are you talking about, Simone?" Dominique demanded, her voice shrill and desperate. "Chadwick is building the premier luxury condominium tower in Midtown. He is a visionary developer." "Your husband is a visionary scam artist," I corrected, keeping my tone perfectly even and relentlessly cold. 3 weeks ago, my firm was contracted to conduct a surprise forensic audit on the primary holding company managing the Midtown Tower project. Do you want to know what I found when I dug into those classified ledgers, Chadwick? Chadwick opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He just stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. "I found a textbook Ponzi scheme," I announced, projecting my voice so every word struck like a physical blow. "You never broke ground on that luxury tower. There are no permits filed, no construction crews hired, and absolutely zero concrete poured. You took tens of millions from new investors and used that money to pay off the massive crippling debts from your previous failed developments. You have been shuffling phantom money around for 5 years just to maintain your illusion of generational wealth. Now the music has finally stopped. The federal authorities are closing in, and you are exactly $5 million short of covering your tracks before the auditors submit their final report to the Department of Justice tomorrow morning." Dominique gasped, dropping Chadwick's arm as if he had caught on fire. She backed away, her hands covering her mouth in pure horror. The golden child was finally realizing that her entire life was built on a crumbling foundation of lies. The devastation was not over yet. I turned my attention away from the pathetic man and locked eyes with my father. Carlton had been standing rigidly by the door, trying desperately to maintain his posture of authority. Now sweat was visibly beading on his forehead. "You knew about this, did you not, Carlton?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, accusatory whisper. "You always bragged about being the smartest financial mind in Atlanta. You knew Chadwick was running a scam, but you decided to cover for him anyway. Why would a distinguished businessman like yourself do something so monumentally stupid?" Vivian stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Simone, that is enough. Do not speak to your father that way. He is a highly respected pillar of this community." "High as a common thief, mother," I shot back, watching her flinch. "And you are both completely bankrupt because of him. When the country club kicked you out for bouncing checks, I thought you had just been living beyond your means. But the audit revealed something much darker, much more sinister. The money did not just vanish into designer clothes and lavish parties, it went directly into Chadwick's failing corporate accounts." Carlton's chest heaved. He raised a shaking hand, trying to silence me, but I refused to stop. "Tell them what you did, Carlton," I commanded, stepping up to him. "Tell your precious, perfect family how you tried to save your golden son-in-law. You did not just empty your personal savings accounts. You did not just mortgage the family estate to the absolute brink of foreclosure. You crossed a line that you can never uncross." The private dining room was suffocatingly quiet. Terrence watched in stunned silence as I dismantled the patriarchal figure who had terrorized my entire childhood. When Chadwick's scheme started collapsing 6 months ago, he came to you for a bailout. I explained, laying out the timeline with brutal precision. But you were already broke, so you used your position as the chief executive officer of your logistics company. You bypassed the board of directors, forged the necessary authorization signatures, and illegally wired $7 million from your own employees' pension fund directly into Chadwick's offshore accounts. Vivian let out a piercing, high-pitched scream. She grabbed Carlton's suit jacket, her eyes wild with panic. "Tell me she is lying, Carlton. Tell me you did not touch the company pension fund." Carlton could not look at his wife. He stared blankly at the floor, his entire body rigid with absolute guilt. He stole the retirement savings of hundreds of hardworking men and women just to keep Dominique in designer handbags. I declared, feeling a surge of righteous fury. And it still was not enough. Chadwick burned through that stolen pension money in less than 4 months. Now the quarterly financial reports are due. If you do not replace that missing $7 million by the end of the week, the board of directors will discover the embezzlement. You will not just lose your company, Carlton. You will die in a federal penitentiary. The reality of their complete and utter destruction crashed down upon them. They had marched into this restaurant expecting to bully me into handing over my husband's hard-earned fortune. Instead, they had walked right into a merciless interrogation that laid bare their darkest, most damning crimes. They were trapped, ruined, and facing decades behind bars. Dominique was sobbing hysterically, sinking onto one of the dining chairs. Vivian was hyperventilating, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. Chadwick looked ready to faint entirely, but Carlton did not collapse. The distinguished, polished facade he had maintained for decades abruptly vanished, replaced by the cornered, desperate look of a deeply dangerous man. He pushed Vivian roughly, stepping forward with a chilling, predatory glare. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He was no longer trying to negotiate. He was preparing to destroy us by any means necessary. The heavy silence in the private dining room was suddenly shattered by the sharp clatter of plastic hitting the thick marble table. Carlton abruptly withdrew his shaking hand from his tailored suit jacket and tossed a small silver flash drive directly into the center of the spilled water. It sat there, a tiny piece of technology that seemed entirely out of place among the fine crystal and fine dining remnants. He did not look like a defeated man anymore. He looked like a cornered animal, willing to inflict maximum casualties to ensure his own survival. His breathing had slowed, and the panic that had previously seized him was entirely replaced by a cold, calculating malice. "Do you honestly believe I would walk into this room without an absolute guarantee of my own success?" Carlton asked, his voice dripping with an arrogant, venomous confidence. "You are not the only person who knows how to manipulate numbers, Simone. You might be a highly skilled forensic accountant, but I have spent the last 30 years mastering the dark arts of corporate warfare. I knew my son-in-law was bleeding my accounts dry months ago, and I knew your husband's little software company was preparing for an initial public offering, so I took the extremely necessary precautions to safely secure my family's legacy." Terrence kept his physical stance completely relaxed, but his dark eyes narrowed as he stared at the silver drive resting on the table. Aaliyah shifted nervously behind him, sensing the sudden escalation in the room's dangerous atmosphere. I stepped slightly forward, maintaining my position between my vulnerable stepdaughter and the monstrous man who had raised me. "What exactly is on that drive, Carlton?" I demanded, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the overwhelming urge to completely shatter his smug expression. "What lies have you manufactured to threaten my husband?" Carlton let out a dark, booming laugh that made Dominique flinch. "That flash drive contains a remarkably convincing collection of internal financial memos, fabricated email chains, and altered revenue projections," Carlton explained, pacing slowly back and forth across the plush carpet. "These fabricated documents have been meticulously and carefully designed by the absolute best fixers in Atlanta to look exactly like your husband committed massive, systemic corporate fraud during the 2 years leading up to his highly publicized public offering. The files show a clear, undeniable, and disturbing pattern of inflating subscriber numbers, hiding massive server debts, and bribing independent auditors to look the other way. My heart skipped a painful beat, but I forced my facial expression to remain an unreadable mask of stone. I knew Terrence ran a perfectly clean operation, but in the ruthless world of Wall Street, the absolute truth often mattered significantly less than the appearance of a scandal. "Those fabricated documents are completely fake," Terrence stated flatly, his deep voice rumbling with quiet power. "Any legitimate federal investigator would see right through them within 48 hours of opening the files." 48 hours is more than enough time to completely destroy you," Carlton fired back, stopping his pacing to point a menacing finger at my husband. "I have a scheduled email ready to send this entire fabricated dossier directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the lead investigative desk at the Wall Street Journal. By the time the opening bell rings on Monday morning, the news of your massive corporate fraud will be everywhere. The federal government will immediately halt trading on your stock. Your board of directors will be forced to suspend you as chief executive officer, pending a comprehensive internal review. Your brand new angry shareholders will launch a massive, devastating class action lawsuit against you right before lunch." Chadwick, who had been cowering in the corner just moments ago, suddenly regained his arrogant posture. The wealthy white developer saw his lifeline and immediately latched onto it. "He is absolutely right," Chadwick sneered, stepping back up to the table. "You will be tied up in federal court for the next 10 years. The legal fees alone will completely bankrupt you. Even when you are eventually cleared of all charges, the permanent stain on your reputation will ensure that no respectable venture capital firm ever works with you again. You will completely lose the company, the fortune, and the legacy you claim to have built." Vivian, sensing the sudden shift in power, smoothed down the front of her outdated emerald green suit and stepped up to stand proudly beside her ruthless husband. The sheer panic she had displayed just moments ago had completely vanished, replaced by the same cold, calculating superiority she had weaponized against me throughout my entire childhood. She slowly looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "We tried to do this the easy way, Simone," Vivian declared, her voice echoing harshly in the confined space. "We tried to simply ask for what we are owed, but you decided to be difficult and embarrass your own flesh and blood. You forced your father to use his leverage. Now the price of our silence has gone up significantly." I stared at my mother, sickened by the profound depths of her depravity. "You would actually frame an innocent man for a federal crime. You would destroy a company that employs hundreds of people just to save yourselves from the consequences of your own embezzlement." "I will do whatever it takes to protect the entire Sterling family empire." Vivian snapped, her eyes flashing with dangerous intensity. "You are going to make him sign over exactly 20% of his total corporate equity by midnight tonight. You will force Terrence to sign the legal transfer documents granting us complete total immunity and absolute financial control, or we will ruin his life forever. We will strip away every single dollar he has ever earned. We will completely obliterate his name in this city, and we will send your entire pathetic family right back to the miserable, impoverished gutter where you truly belong." Carlton withdrew a silver digital timer, placing it beside the flash drive. With a thumb press, 5 red minutes illuminated and the countdown began. The silent flashing felt like a heavy weight pressing down. "You have 5 minutes, sign over 20% equity," Carlton stated, devoid of warmth. "When 0 hits, I send the fabricated dossier to every financial news outlet and federal agency. Your husband's company will be paralyzed and bankrupted before sunrise." Dominique let out a shrill laugh, stepping away from the wall, her humiliation erased by the promise of stolen wealth. "Thought you could outsmart us, Simone?" Dominique taunted. "You were incredibly naive. You played with spreadsheets but never understood real power. Daddy always wins." Chadwick puffed out his chest. His cowardly fear was entirely gone, replaced by the smug arrogance of a man believing his privilege made him utterly invincible. "You should have just paid the consulting fee when I asked nicely," Chadwick sneered, looking down at Terrence. "Now you are going to lose roughly $9 million if the current market valuation holds. But do not worry, Terrence. We will be sure to send a thank you card when we spend your money to save my real estate development project." I needed them to explicitly state their malicious intentions. So I forced my shoulders to drop. I let my hands tremble slightly, stepping backward until I bumped into my dining chair. I widened my eyes, projecting an image of crushing defeat. You cannot actually be serious about doing this, I pleaded, making my voice sound desperate and fragile. This is undeniable extortion. If you send those fabricated files, you will completely ruin Terrence. You will destroy the financial security of your grandchild. Aaliyah finally has a stable home, and you are threatening to burn it to the ground just to cover up your massive financial crimes. I focused entirely on my mother. Vivian stood tall in her outdated suit, watching my fabricated breakdown with profound satisfaction. Mother, please, I begged, taking a slow step toward her. I am your own flesh and blood. You brought me into this world. How can you consciously choose to obliterate my marriage just to save Chadwick from going to prison? Vivian did not flinch. She did not show a single ounce of basic human empathy. Instead, she lifted her chin, her eyes narrowing into calculating slits. Do not dare try to manipulate me with emotional appeals about motherhood, Simone. Vivian snapped, her voice echoing sharply. You ceased being my daughter the moment you refused to marry the judge's son. You humiliated this family when you ran off with a penniless single father. Vivian pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. My loyalty does not lie with you, and it certainly does not lie with your urban fairy tale of a marriage. My absolute loyalty belongs to the Sterling family empire. We have spent 4 decades building our elite reputation. We are royalty in Buckhead. We control the narrative, we control the social circles, and we control the wealth. If saving that legacy requires me to completely sacrifice your husband's company, I will do it without a second thought. She took a step closer, lowering her voice into a venomous hiss. You owe us this money. You owe us for the embarrassment you caused. You owe us for the years we spent explaining your poor life choices to our country club friends. So yes, Simone, I will gladly destroy your husband. I will gladly take his money to save Chadwick's business and your father's pension fund. Loyalty to the family empire completely supersedes your pathetic, insignificant marriage. You are nothing but collateral damage in our survival strategy. The timer flashed brightly. 3 minutes and 20 seconds remaining. The sheer cruelty of my mother's words hung heavily in the air. She had just verbally confirmed her active, willing participation in a massive federal extortion plot. She had explicitly stated her motive and her complete lack of remorse. It was exactly what I needed her to say. I stopped trembling. I straightened my spine, letting the terrified daughter facade fall away. I looked at the red numbers ticking down, and a genuine, deeply satisfied smile formed on my lips. Dominique noticed the shift in my posture. Her smirk faltered slightly. Why are you smiling? She demanded, betraying a tiny fraction of uncertainty. You have less than 3 minutes before Daddy ruins your entire life. You should be begging us for mercy. I did not answer her. Instead, I turned my attention back to the head of the table. Throughout this vicious exchange, Terrence had remained seated in his wooden chair. He had kept his broad shoulders angled protectively toward Aaliyah, his large hands gently covering her ears, whispering soft, reassuring words to keep her calm. He was the absolute picture of a fierce, unshakable father protecting his child from a storm of toxic predators. But now the storm had reached its peak. The trap had been fully set, and the prey had marched willingly into the center of the snare. Terrence slowly lowered his hands from Aaliyah. He gave his daughter a warm, confident smile, nodding once to silently assure her that everything was perfectly fine. Then he turned his powerful gaze back toward the violent intruders standing in our private dining suite. He calmly reached out across the tablecloth. He bypassed the spilled water, ignored the blinking digital timer, and completely disregarded the silver flash drive. Instead, Terrence picked up the printed list of demands that Vivian had slammed down at the very beginning of the confrontation. He held the crisp sheet of paper in his hands, his calm eyes slowly scanning the outrageous, highly illegal financial requirements printed in bold black ink. Then, without showing a single trace of fear, he reached deep into the inner pocket of his own tailored suit jacket and slowly pulled out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. Dominique let out a triumphant sigh, watching the heavy gold fountain pen gleam under the crystal chandelier. She nudged Chadwick, her diamond bracelets clinking in the quiet room. Chadwick puffed out his chest, his arrogant posture returning now that he believed his bailout was secured. Vivian smoothed down her outdated emerald green suit, a viciously satisfied smirk spreading across her face. She looked at Carlton, exchanging a victorious glance that spoke volumes about their shared history of crushing anyone who dared to oppose their empire. Carlton stood near the head of the table, his eyes locked onto my husband. The flashing red numbers on the timer reflected in his dark eyes, counting down the final 60 seconds. They believed they had completely broken the brilliant tech founder. They thought they had forced the self-made billionaire to his knees, stripping him of his wealth to protect his family from their fabricated corporate scandal. Terrence did not rush. He took his time reading every word printed on that crisp sheet of paper. He examined the outrageous financial figures, the demands to pay off the Buckhead estate mortgage, the forced capital injection into Chadwick's failing real estate scheme, and the ridiculous trust fund requirement for my sister. He read it as carefully as he read the complex data algorithms that had made him wealthy. The timer ticked down to 45 seconds. Carlton tapped his expensive leather shoe against the hardwood floor, projecting impatience to rush the signature. "Sign the paper, Terrence," Carlton demanded, his voice thick with condescension. "Just authorize the immediate transfer of the 20% equity and commit to funding these line items. You will still have a few million left over to take care of my ungrateful daughter and your little girl. Consider this a discounted tuition fee for learning how the real world operates in Atlanta." Terrence finished reading the final sentence. He looked at the bottom of the page where a blank line waited. He brought the tip of his gold fountain pen down toward the paper, hovering above the smooth surface. Dominique let out an excited breath. Vivian stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with unfiltered greed. But Terrence did not write his name. Instead, he placed the cap back onto the fountain pen with a loud, definitive click. He set the pen down on the table next to the spilled water. He picked up the printed list of demands, folded it into thirds, and slid it directly into his inner jacket pocket. Then he looked directly at my father, his handsome face breaking into a wide, genuine smile. "Perfect," Terrence said, his deep voice carrying a terrifyingly calm resonance. The unified smirk on the faces of my family members instantly evaporated. Carlton frowned, stepping forward with his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "What did you just say?" Carlton barked, his voice rising in panic. "What do you mean, perfect? You did not sign the transfer agreement. You have exactly 30 seconds left before I send the fabricated dossier to the Wall Street Journal and completely obliterate your newly public company." Terrence leaned back in his chair, wrapping his arm protectively around my waist. "It is absolutely perfect, Carlton," my husband explained, his tone completely devoid of any fear. "You see, when a man builds a $44 million enterprise from a damp garage, he learns how to spot a hostile takeover from a mile away. Simone and I knew your bogus real estate empire was imploding 3 weeks ago. My wife is the best forensic accountant in the state, and she discovered Chadwick's pathetic Ponzi scheme before the banks even realized they were bleeding money. We knew you were broke, we knew you embezzled your own employees' pension fund, and we knew you would come here tonight to try and steal my life's work to cover up your massive federal crimes." Vivian gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest. Dominique stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally understanding that we had anticipated their every single move. "We needed you to corner yourselves," I added, speaking directly to my mother. "We needed you to walk into this private room, present an outrageous list of financial demands, and explicitly state your intention to frame an innocent man for a corporate crime if he refused to pay you." Terrence reached over to the table and picked up his smartphone, which had been lying face down near his water glass since the very beginning of the dinner. "You demanded $17.5 million in exchange for not releasing fake financial documents," Terrence stated, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "You laid out the terms, you provided the motive, and you handed me the physical evidence of your extortion plot on a printed sheet of paper." He slowly flipped his smartphone over, turning the bright screen toward my parents. "Now my lawyer has proof." The screen displayed a live high-definition video call that had been actively running for the past 25 minutes. The microphone had been muted on our end to prevent any feedback, but the camera had captured every single second of their threats, their confessions of embezzlement, and their vicious blackmail attempts. Carlton stumbled backward, his face rapidly draining of all its color, as he stared at the two very serious men sitting on the other side of the digital connection. On the left side of the screen sat Marcus Vance, Terrence's ruthless corporate attorney, sitting in his downtown corner office with a notepad full of freshly transcribed quotes. But it was the man sitting on the right side of the screen that made my father completely stop breathing. The second man wore a perfectly tailored dark federal suit, with a prominent gold badge clipped securely to his thick leather belt. He was a very high-ranking and highly decorated federal agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically assigned to the Special Division of Financial Extortion and Wire Fraud. The sharp voice of Marcus Vance shattered the heavy silence in the private dining room. The high-definition video feed transmitted his words through Terrence's smartphone speaker. "Good evening." Marcus began adjusting his silver-framed glasses. "I want to explicitly clarify the legal parameters before anyone claims a privacy violation. The District of Columbia operates strictly under a one-party consent law regarding private conversations. Because my client is an active participant and has given full consent, every second of this broadcast is admissible in a federal court." Carlton stared at the screen, his jaw hanging open as the catastrophic reality began to settle over his rigid posture. "For 25 minutes, my team has been recording and backing up this interaction to 3 cloud servers." Marcus continued, devoid of mercy. "We have footage of Vivian demanding $17 million. We have Chadwick openly admitting his real estate project is a fraudulent scheme. We have a confession regarding the embezzlement of $7 million from your pension fund. And most importantly, we have Carlton explicitly threatening to release a fabricated dossier to the Wall Street Journal to manipulate the stock price of a public company." Dominique let out a terrified whimper, shrinking back against the wall. Chadwick looked as though he might vomit onto the carpet. "You set us up," Vivian whispered, trembling with shock and outrage. "You deliberately brought us in here just to record us." "You brought yourselves here, Mother," I corrected, keeping my voice loud and incredibly firm. "We simply opened the door and let your own greed do the rest of the heavy lifting." The second man on the digital screen leaned forward, resting his forearms on a mahogany desk. The fluorescent lighting caught the gleaming surface of his federal badge. "Let me introduce myself," the man said, his voice commanding immediate respect. "I am Special Agent Hayes with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I oversee the regional task force dedicated to corporate espionage, wire fraud, and high-level financial extortion. I have been listening to your conversation with extreme interest." Chadwick practically jumped away from the dining table, raising his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender. "Agent Hayes, you have to understand, we were just blowing off steam. This was just a heated family argument. We never intended to release any documents." "Do not insult my intelligence," Agent Hayes snapped, shutting down Chadwick's pathetic defense. "I just watched you participate in a coordinated conspiracy to extort a public chief executive officer. I heard the exact dollar amounts you demanded. I saw the physical flash drive hit the table. That is not a simple family dispute. That is a textbook violation of the Hobbs Act, combined with a blatant conspiracy to commit federal securities fraud." The FBI agent picked up a printed file, holding it up to the camera. "My division has been tracking the irregularities in your real estate holding company for 3 weeks, Chadwick," Agent Hayes revealed. "We were preparing to execute a raid on your Midtown offices on Monday morning, but this recorded extortion attempt just handed us the final piece of evidence we needed to expedite the warrants. You practically gift-wrapped your own federal indictment." Agent Hayes shifted his piercing gaze toward my father, who was swaying slightly on his expensive leather shoes. "As for you, Carlton," the agent continued, his voice dropping into a menacing register, "embezzling $7 million from an employee pension fund violates the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. When you combine that charge with the attempted manipulation of federal stock markets, wire fraud, and active extortion, you are looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of 35 years in a federal penitentiary. Given your advanced age, that is an absolute life sentence." "This is illegal entrapment," Carlton suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with desperate fear. "You cannot use a secret recording to prosecute us. I know my constitutional rights." "You clearly do not know the law as well as you think you do," Marcus Vance interjected smoothly from his side of the split screen. "There is no entrapment here, Carlton. Nobody forced you to create a fake dossier. Nobody forced you to demand 20% equity in my client's company. You orchestrated this malicious plot entirely on your own, and you gleefully bragged about your criminal methodology on a live legal video feed. Terrence reached out and picked up the silver flash drive, holding it casually between his long fingers. I warned you 9 years ago that your arrogance would eventually destroy you, Terrence said, looking directly at my trembling father. You spent your entire life believing that your money and your social status made you untouchable. You thought you could crush anyone who did not fit into your narrow, bigoted worldview. But out here in the real world, actions have devastating consequences. Vivian stumbled forward, reaching a shaking hand toward the smartphone. Terrence, please, she begged, tears freely streaming down her heavily made-up face. We are family. You cannot send my husband to prison. You cannot leave us with absolutely nothing. You stopped being family the day you looked at my little girl and called her extra baggage, Terrence replied, his voice devoid of any forgiveness. You made your choices, Vivian. Now you get to live with them. Agent Hayes leaned closer to the camera, his expression completely resolute. Federal agents are currently pulling up to the front entrance of the restaurant. Do not attempt to leave the room. Do not attempt to destroy any evidence. The reality finally slammed into Carlton with the brutal force of a runaway freight train. The mighty patriarch of the Sterling family empire, the man who had terrorized me and ruled Buckhead society with an iron fist, suddenly gasped for air. He staggered backward, his hands flying up to clutch at the center of his chest. His eyes bulged in sheer, unadulterated terror as his face turned a ghostly, horrifying shade of ash white. Chadwick spared no sympathy for his father-in-law. The arrogant developer took one look at Carlton, clutching his chest, and immediately shoved him away. Self-preservation kicked in with cowardly intensity. Chadwick practically threw himself toward Terrence's smartphone, waving his hands frantically at the camera where Special Agent Hayes was quietly observing the meltdown. Agent Hayes, you must listen to me! Chadwick yelled, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal. I had nothing to do with that silver flash drive. I swear I have never seen those fake documents before this minute. The SEC dossier was entirely Carlton's idea. He came to my office yesterday in an absolute panic. He said he needed to manufacture a corporate scandal to save his logistics company. I am completely innocent of this extortion plot. Carlton lowered his hands, his terror transforming into homicidal rage. You lying, ungrateful snake, Carlton roared, his distinguished southern drawl evaporating. You were the one crying in my study 3 weeks ago. You begged me to bail out your fraudulent Midtown Tower project. You told me federal auditors were circling your fake accounts. I risked my entire pension fund to save your miserable life. You risked your pension to save your pathetic social status, Chadwick fired back, jabbing a finger at Carlton. You could not stand your country club friends finding out your daughter married a broke fraud. You wanted to use my connections to stay relevant in Buckhead. But you are just a desperate old man playing a dangerous game. I am not going to federal prison for your stupid mistakes. Dominique let out a blood-curdling shriek. She lunged forward, grabbing Chadwick by the lapels of his expensive custom suit. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails dug fiercely into the expensive fabric. How dare you speak to my father that way? Dominique screamed, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. My father gave you millions to save your pathetic business. You swore to me we were untouchable. You promised we would take Terrence's money and move to Europe. You are my husband. You are supposed to protect this family, not throw my father to the federal authorities. Chadwick forcefully shoved Dominique backward. She stumbled in her designer heels, crashing heavily against the edge of the long mahogany dining table. I am protecting myself from your criminal family, Chadwick sneered, looking down at his wife with disgust. You are just as delusional as your parents. You spend $50,000 a month trying to maintain an influencer lifestyle while we are drowning in eviction notices. I am sick of funding your fake reality. I am done playing the supportive husband to a woman whose existence is a massive lie. I should have divorced you when the repo men took your white Porsche. Dominique let out another piercing scream. She picked up a heavy crystal water goblet and hurled it directly at Chadwick's head. He ducked wildly, and the glass shattered into 100 jagged pieces against the fabric-lined wall. The sound of breaking glass echoed like a gunshot in the confined private suite. Carlton lunged at Chadwick, his large hands reaching for the younger man's throat. Chadwick dodged the attack, shoving Carlton hard in the chest. The two men crashed into a serving cart, sending silverware and champagne flutes tumbling onto the floor in a chaotic avalanche of destruction. They were grabbing at each other, shouting vicious insults, completely abandoning the elite personas they spent decades cultivating. I stood securely behind Terrence, quietly watching the absolute destruction of the Sterling family empire unfold right before my very eyes. 9 years ago, these people had sat in our living room and told me that my husband was a worthless thug. They had claimed that their superior breeding and generational wealth made them infinitely better than us. Now they were violently brawling in the middle of a five-star restaurant, tearing each other apart like rabid dogs fighting over a discarded scrap of meat. They were finally showing their true, hideous colors. "Simone, you have to call off the federal agents," Dominique cried out, abandoning her fight with Chadwick to turn her frantic attention to me. Her designer makeup was running down her face in thick, dark streaks. "You cannot let them arrest me. I am a public figure. My reputation will be completely destroyed. My sponsors will drop me instantly. Please, Simone, tell your husband to drop the charges." I looked at my older sister, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy emptiness. "You destroyed your own reputation, Dominique," I replied calmly. "You built your entire brand on stolen money and massive lies. The federal agents are just here tonight to collect the receipt." The screaming between Carlton and Chadwick escalated into a physical shoving match near the heavy oak doors. They were totally trapped, furiously fighting over who would take the blame for a federal conspiracy that we had meticulously caught on tape. The flawless, impenetrable alliance that had terrorized my childhood was officially dead and buried. Vivian had not joined the physical brawl. She had been standing near the corner of the room watching her husband and her son-in-law tear each other to shreds. She looked at the shattered crystal on the floor, then at the muted video call still running on Terrence's smartphone. The flashing blue and red lights of federal law enforcement vehicles suddenly reflected through the sheer curtains of the restaurant's front windows. The authorities had officially arrived. Vivian's eyes widened in sheer absolute panic. The haughty, untouchable queen of Atlanta's high society suddenly realized that she was entirely out of options. She turned her frantic gaze toward me. She stumbled forward, her knees giving out completely as she collapsed heavily onto the plush restaurant carpet. Vivian reached out with trembling hands, grabbing fistfuls of the fabric of my elegant evening dress, looking up at me with tears streaming down her terrified face as she prepared to beg for mercy. Vivian tightened her desperate grip on the expensive silk of my evening gown. The heavy tears cascading down her perfectly contoured cheeks were no longer a calculated performance. They were born of pure, unadulterated terror. The woman who had ruled Atlanta society with an iron fist, the matriarch who had dictated my every flaw since childhood, was now kneeling in spilled water and shattered crystal, weeping like a frightened child. "Simone, my beautiful girl, please," Vivian sobbed, her voice trembling violently. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot send your own father to a federal you for 9 months. I held you when you were sick. Do you not remember when you were 7 years old and you broke your arm falling off your bicycle? I stayed awake with you for 3 straight nights. I brushed your hair and sang you to sleep. Blood is thicker than water, Simone. We are your family. You have to tell those federal agents to erase the video. You have to save us from this nightmare." She reached her shaking hands higher, attempting to grasp my wrists, but I forcefully pulled my arms away. The sheer audacity of her manipulation was absolutely staggering. She was desperately weaponizing a handful of decent childhood memories to excuse 3 decades of systematic emotional abuse. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, forcing my mother's grasping hands to slide off the slick fabric of my dress. I looked down at the pathetic, broken woman kneeling on the ruined carpet. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the crushing, suffocating guilt that had dictated my entire youth. I only felt an overwhelming sense of profound clarity. "Do not dare weaponize the concept of motherhood against me," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, unwavering authority that made my sister Dominique stop her hysterical crying across the room. "You did not stay awake with me when I broke my arm because you loved me, Mother. You stayed awake because you were terrified that a visible cast would ruin the perfect family aesthetic for the upcoming country club portrait session." You spent those 3 nights complaining about how my clumsiness was a massive inconvenience to your carefully planned social calendar. Vivian flinched violently, her eyes widening as the harsh reality of her own toxic parenting was thrown directly back into her face. Blood is thicker than water. I repeated her words, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. That is the absolute favorite catchphrase of abusers who want a free pass to continuously torture their relatives without facing any consequences. You never treated me like blood. You treated me like a highly defective asset. For 33 years, your love was strictly conditional. It was entirely dependent on my ability to boost your precious social standing. When I got straight as I was acceptable. When I refused to attend a private university because I wanted to study forensic accounting, I became a massive disappointment. When I refused to marry a corrupt judge's arrogant son to secure your political connections, I became a literal disgrace. I stepped around the broken shards of the water goblet that Dominique had thrown at Chadwick, keeping my intense gaze locked firmly on my mother. You spent my entire life gaslighting me into believing I was the problem. You convinced me that my introversion was a character flaw, that my dedication to my career was masculine and unattractive, and that my desire for genuine love was a pathetic weakness. You made me feel like an unwelcome guest in my own childhood home. And when I finally found a man who loved me exactly as I am, a man who built his life from scratch with pure integrity, you completely erased me from your world. Terrence stood silently behind me, his protective presence a steady anchor in the chaotic room. He kept his large hands resting gently on Aaliyah's shoulders, shielding her from the ugliness of my biological family. I turned my head slightly, looking at my beautiful, intelligent stepdaughter. Then I turned my attention back to the weeping woman on the floor. But the absolute worst part, the one thing that guarantees I will never ever forgive you, is how you treated an innocent child. I declared, my voice dropping into a deadly venomous register. You looked at a sweet motherless 5-year-old girl and you called her extra baggage. You looked at a child who needed love and you labeled her a heavy burden that would ruin my social status. You tried to poison my marriage before it even began, simply because Terrence did not have a trust fund or a recognized family name. Vivian shook her head frantically, holding her hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. I was wrong, Simone. I was so wrong about everything. I see that now. Terrence is a wonderful man. He is brilliant and successful. We can start over. We can be a real family again. I promise you things will be entirely different from now on. You are only saying that because you are looking down the barrel of a massive federal indictment. I fired back relentlessly. You do not love Terrence. You love his newly public stock portfolio. You do not love me. You love the fact that I am currently holding the key to your survival. But the bank is officially closed, Mother. I am completely done paying the emotional tax of being your daughter. I am done shrinking myself to fit into your miserable, bankrupt world. You brought this absolute destruction upon yourselves. You walked into this private dining suite with a printed list of demands, completely ready to frame an innocent tech founder for a federal crime. You made your incredibly toxic bed, and now you are going to lie in it for the rest of your natural life. Restaurant security and local law enforcement entered the room. 4 heavily armed police officers stepped past the stunned restaurant manager, their presence instantly draining the remaining oxygen from the private suite. The lead officer, a tall man with a severe expression, immediately locked his eyes on my father and my brother-in-law. The loud, chaotic sounds of the shattered glass being stepped on accompanied their heavy boots. From the smartphone still resting on the table, Special Agent Hayes projected his voice clearly. Officers, you have federal authorization to detain Carlton Sterling and Chadwick Montgomery, Agent Hayes instructed through the speaker. The formal federal warrants for extortion, wire fraud, and conspiracy are currently being processed by a federal judge. Secure the suspects. The lead officer nodded, reaching for the heavy metal handcuffs clipped to his tactical belt. Carlton Sterling, Chadwick Montgomery, you are being detained. Put your hands behind your backs immediately. Chadwick began to hyperventilate. The arrogant, privileged real estate developer, who had just demanded $5 million from my husband, was now physically shaking like a terrified child. He stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen chair. "You do not understand," Chadwick screamed, his voice cracking wildly. "I am a prominent developer in this city. My family has operated in Atlanta for 4 generations. You cannot just arrest me in a restaurant. I demand to call my private attorney." "You will have plenty of time to make a phone call from a federal holding cell," the second officer replied coldly. He grabbed Chadwick by the shoulder, spinning the younger man around and forcefully pinning his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed through the room. My father did not put up a physical fight. The former titan of the logistics industry simply stared at the approaching officers with an empty, hollow expression. The reality of his complete destruction had finally paralyzed him. As the third officer grabbed Carlton's wrists and secured the metal cuffs, my father looked over his shoulder at me. He expected to see sympathy. He expected to see a daughter willing to sacrifice herself to save his fraudulent legacy. Instead, he saw a woman standing proudly beside her brilliant husband, entirely unfazed by his dramatic downfall. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead officer began, reciting the Miranda rights with a loud, practiced authority. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Vivian remained on her knees on the ruined carpet. Her outdated emerald green suit was soaked with spilled water and stained with dirt. She watched the officers read her husband his rights, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. The absolute worst fear of any social climber was unfolding right before her eyes. She was losing her money, her husband, and her freedom all in the exact same hour. "Please," Vivian begged, looking up at the restaurant manager who stood nervously near the entrance. "Please close the doors. Do not let anyone out there see us like this. We are highly respected members of the Buckhead community." I stepped forward, my elegant evening dress brushing against the floor. I looked directly at the restaurant manager. "Leave the doors wide open," I instructed him firmly. "In fact, please prop them open. My parents have always loved being the absolute center of attention at high society events. It would be incredibly selfish of us to deny them an audience on their most important night." The manager nodded quickly, pushing the heavy oak doors as far back as they would go and securing them with 2 brass doorstops. The main dining room of the exclusive restaurant was entirely packed. Atlanta's elite business owners, prominent politicians, and wealthy socialites were seated at the surrounding tables. Many of them were former friends and associates of my parents. These were the exact same people Vivian and Carlton had desperately tried to impress for the last 30 years. These were the people who had blacklisted them from the country club. As the police officers began to march Carlton and Chadwick toward the exit, the noise in the main dining room completely died down. Hundreds of wealthy patrons stopped eating. They put down their silver forks and their crystal wine glasses. They turned their heads, staring in absolute shock as the mighty Sterling family was paraded through the center of the restaurant like common street criminals. The whispers started immediately. The hushed, scandalous rumors spread from table to table like wildfire. Several patrons discreetly pulled out their smartphones, snapping pictures and recording videos of the unbelievable spectacle. The humiliation was absolute and irreversible. Carlton kept his head bowed, unable to make eye contact with his former peers. Chadwick wept openly, his tears ruining his expensive silk tie. Dominique watched the horrific procession begin. She looked out into the main dining area and locked eyes with 3 different lifestyle influencers she desperately envied. They were holding up their phones, eagerly broadcasting her ultimate social demise to thousands of eager followers live on social media. The golden child completely panicked. She realized she was about to be photographed walking behind a handcuffed husband. Dominique let out a frantic shriek and violently shoved past the restaurant manager. She tried to make a desperate run for the emergency exit located near the kitchen. She sprinted wildly, but her massive designer heels snagged sharply on the edge of the plush carpet. She lost her balance entirely. A female police officer standing by the doorway reacted instantly. The officer stepped sideways, extending a strong arm to block the fleeing woman. Dominique slammed hard into the officer, tumbling forcefully onto the hard floor. Her incredibly tight luxury dress ripped loudly right down the back seam, completely exposing her cheap undergarments. She lay there, utterly humiliated, loudly weeping in the dirt, totally destroyed. Perfect. The heavy oak doors of the private dining suite slowly swung shut, cutting off the frantic sounds of Dominique's sobbing and the stern voices of the federal agents echoing down the corridor. The sudden silence that fell over the room was absolute and profound. It was a thick, heavy quiet that rushed in to fill the massive vacuum left behind by my toxic family. I stood frozen near the entrance for a long moment, my chest heaving as the adrenaline began to drain away. The pristine white tablecloth was ruined by spilled water, and the harsh glare of the crystal shards scattered across the expensive carpet served as the only physical evidence of the violent storm that had just ripped through our celebratory evening. I turned around slowly. Terrence was standing exactly where I had left him, his tall frame still acting as a physical shield between the chaos and his teenage daughter. He took a deep, shuddering breath, running a large hand over his face before turning to look at me. The cold mask of the ruthless corporate founder vanished entirely instantly, replaced by the warm, deeply loving expression of the husband I adored. Terrence stepped over the broken glass and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a fiercely tight embrace. I buried my face in his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne. For 33 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of my parents' expectations, their conditional love, and their relentless emotional abuse. Now that massive burden was completely gone. I had finally severed the rotten roots of the Sterling family tree, and I was standing securely on solid ground. "Are you okay?" Terrence whispered, his deep voice vibrating against my cheek. "That was incredibly intense, Simone." "I am entirely okay," I replied, looking into his warm eyes. "I feel like I can finally breathe." We turned our attention to Aaliyah. The 14-year-old girl was still sitting at the large mahogany table. I felt a sudden sharp stab of anxiety. We had just exposed her to a terrifying display of greed, betrayal, and federal arrests. I had desperately wanted to protect her from the ugly reality of my biological family, but they had forced their way into our safe space. I walked quickly over to her chair, kneeling down so that we were at eye level. "Alia, sweetheart, I am so incredibly sorry you had to witness that terrible scene," I said, reaching out to gently take her hands in mine. "I never wanted you to see that side of them. You should never have had to hear those cruel things my mother said." Alia looked at me, her dark eyes wide and thoughtful. She did not look traumatized. She did not look like a frightened child who had just watched her stepmother's family get hauled away in handcuffs. Instead, a slow, incredibly genuine smile spread across her youthful face. "Why are you apologizing, Simone?" Aaliyah asked, her voice steady and remarkably calm. "That was the most amazing thing I have ever seen in my entire life. You completely destroyed them." Terrence let out a sudden, booming laugh, the tension leaving his broad shoulders completely. He walked over and stood behind Aaliyah, resting his hands proudly on her shoulders. "I thought you would be terrified," I admitted, letting out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. "My mother called you extra baggage. That is a horrific thing for a child to hear." Alia squeezed my hands tightly, her smile growing even brighter. "I do not care what that wicked lady said about me. I know she is a liar. I know you and Dad love me, and I know I am safe with you. Did you see the way Dad stood up to that arrogant white man? Did you see the way you made your father stop breathing just by telling the absolute truth? You two are basically superheroes. They came in here trying to bully us, and you threw them directly into federal prison." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but they were tears of profound, overwhelming joy. This brilliant, resilient girl had seen right through my mother's toxic manipulation. Aaliyah had not internalized the abuse. She had watched her father and her stepmother stand as a unified, impenetrable fortress, and she felt fiercely, undeniably protected. She knew she was not extra baggage. She knew she was the most precious, guarded treasure in our entire world. "You are absolutely right, Aaliyah," Terrence said, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. "Nobody will ever bully this family. We protect our own always." I stood up, wiping away a single stray tear before it could ruin my makeup. The emotional come-down was washing over me, leaving behind a pure, unadulterated sense of victory. The villains had been permanently vanquished. The toxic empire had been completely dismantled. The extortion plot had been brilliantly thwarted, and my husband's $44 million company was entirely safe from their greedy, grasping hands. The heavy oak doors slowly creaked open again. The restaurant manager peeked nervously into the private suite, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly as he held a white cloth towel. He looked at the shattered glass on the floor, then up at us. "I am so deeply sorry for the unprecedented disturbance, Mr. and Mrs. Vance," the manager stammered, stepping cautiously into the room. "The police have completely cleared the premises. I can have a dedicated cleaning crew in here immediately for you." I looked at Terrence, who simply smiled and nodded at me silently, handing me the reins to finish our highly anticipated celebratory evening together. I turned back to the terrified manager, smoothing down the front of my elegant dress with absolute grace. "There is no need to change rooms," I told him calmly, returning to my seat. "Could you please clean the glass and bring us the beautiful fresh dessert tray?" Exactly 14 days after we peacefully enjoyed our decadent dessert in that shattered private dining room, the absolute chaos of our stressful reality transformed into a truly spectacular, undeniably historic triumph for our entire family. The New York Stock Exchange officially opened for public trading on a beautifully crisp Tuesday morning, and my husband's data analytics software company did not just launch successfully. It completely skyrocketed past every single financial projection the Wall Street analysts had previously dared to publish. The initial public offering surged by an unprecedented 200% within the first 4 hours of active trading. Terrence sat right beside me on our very comfortable living room sofa, staring quietly at his vibrating smartphone as his personal net worth violently multiplied. He was no longer just a struggling single father who bravely coded in a dark, damp garage. He was now officially a major tech titan, a widely respected industry pioneer whose brilliant, unwavering vision had just permanently secured our family's enormous generational wealth. The financial victory was incredibly sweet, but the public relations aftermath was even sweeter. Federal court documents regarding the arrests of prominent Atlanta socialites are never kept secret for long. Within 48 hours of the violent restaurant showdown, a highly ambitious investigative journalist got her hands on the unsealed federal indictments. The sensational news broke across every major media outlet in the country. The headlines were absolutely merciless. They detailed the tragic downfall of Carlton and Vivian, explicitly outlining their corporate embezzlement and their pathetic attempt to extort a newly minted billionaire. Chadwick was publicly humiliated, his fake real estate empire exposed as a predatory Ponzi scheme. The media completely devoured the scandal, but they painted Terrence and me in a remarkably different light. We were suddenly hailed as the ultimate power couple. The press loved the narrative of the self-made founder and his fearless forensic accountant wife, who successfully outsmarted the corrupt elites. I left our peaceful home that morning, giving Terrence a warm kiss and hugging Aaliyah before she caught her ride to school. I drove my sleek black car through the bustling morning traffic, heading straight toward the gleaming downtown high-rise where my financial oversight firm occupied the top 3 floors. When I stepped out of the private elevator and walked into the busy main lobby, the entire office felt different. My colleagues offered warm, respectful smiles. Junior analysts quickly stepped aside, whispering excitedly as I walked past them. I had always been highly respected for my intense work ethic, but now I was legendary. I had dismantled a corrupt corporate dynasty using my accounting skills and a perfectly timed video call. I smiled politely at my dedicated assistant, grabbed a fresh cup of hot black coffee, and walked directly into my spacious corner office. I closed the heavy glass door, shutting out the corporate world, and sat down at my desk. I booted up my secure workstation and immediately logged into the highly encrypted federal financial database. I had a very specific, deeply personal task to accomplish this morning. As a senior forensic accountant, I had authorized legal access to the federal bankruptcy court filings. I typed in the familiar names and pressed the search key. The results populated my screen almost instantly, and a cold, satisfied smile slowly spread across my face. The documents were officially finalized and stamped by a federal judge. Chadwick had officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, claiming total financial ruin. The court had already frozen his bank accounts and ordered the immediate liquidation of his remaining assets to pay back the defrauded investors. Dominique was legally tied to his massive debts, her influencer lifestyle permanently destroyed. But the most satisfying documents belonged to my parents. I opened the massive file containing Carlton and Vivian's comprehensive financial disclosures. It was an absolute bloodbath of toxic debt and gross mismanagement. The federal government had seized Carlton's logistics company to cover the $7 million he had maliciously embezzled from the employee pension fund. Their country club memberships were publicly revoked, their luxury vehicles were repossessed by angry creditors, and their heavily maxed-out credit cards were permanently canceled. They possessed absolutely zero liquid cash. The people who had spent my entire life calling me a pathetic failure were now officially documented as completely destitute. They had absolutely nothing left to their famous name except the crushing, suffocating weight of their impending federal criminal trials. I leaned back in my comfortable ergonomic leather chair, taking a slow, deep sip of my hot, delicious coffee. I scrolled carefully through the long, detailed schedule of their liquidated assets, analyzing the brutal math of their absolute downfall. The ruthless court-appointed trustee was moving aggressively to recover any possible funds. I read through the extensive list of seized diamond jewelry, the auctioned luxury furniture, and the liquidated stock portfolios. Then, my eyes locked onto a very specific, highly significant line item buried near the bottom of page 42. My heart skipped a sudden heavy beat in my chest. I leaned closer to the bright monitor, reading the stark, unforgiving legal text 3 full times to ensure I was not actively hallucinating. The federal bankruptcy court had officially listed my parents' sprawling, prestigious Buckhead estate for immediate liquidation. The massive gated mansion where I had endured decades of psychological abuse. The very house where my mother had painted my childhood bedroom, a sickly pale blue, just to assert her cruel dominance, was hitting the public auction block. The bank was foreclosing on the property to satisfy the millions of dollars in outstanding loans Carlton had desperately taken out to fund Chadwick's fraudulent failing schemes. The highly anticipated foreclosure auction was officially scheduled for next Thursday morning at the county courthouse steps. I stared at the bold auction date, a brilliant, highly vindictive plan rapidly forming in my mind. I was finally going to purchase their entire world and completely crush whatever miserable pride they had left. I stared at the glowing computer screen, tracing the bold letters of the foreclosure notice. The massive Buckhead estate, the very fortress where Vivian and Carlton had systematically dismantled my self-worth for over 2 decades, was scheduled for a private bank auction in less than 48 hours. My parents had built their entire identity around those towering columns and manicured lawns. Now it was being liquidated to the highest bidder to satisfy their staggering federal debts. I picked up my mobile phone and immediately called my wealth manager. I instructed him to form a blind proxy limited liability company before the end of the business day. I was going to buy my childhood trauma and bulldoze it into dust. 2 days later, I walked into the grand ballroom of the downtown commercial bank where the private auction was being held. I wore a tailored navy blue suit, blending seamlessly into the back row of wealthy investors and real estate developers. I kept my head down, observing the room. My proxy representative, a sharp corporate attorney named Mr. Sterling, sat in the front row with strict instructions and a blank check from my holding company. Then the grand wooden doors opened, and my older sister walked into the room. Dominique looked absolutely ragged, though she was desperately trying to hide it. She wore a black designer dress that hung slightly loose on her shrinking frame. Her husband Chadwick was nowhere to be seen, locked away in a federal holding cell or drowning in his own bankruptcy hearings. Dominique took a seat near the middle aisle, clutching a small numbered bidding paddle with white-knuckle desperation. I knew exactly why she was here. She had likely scraped together loans from shady associates or begged a distant wealthy connection to back her. If she lost the family estate, she lost her final tether to the Atlanta elite. She would officially become homeless and irrelevant. The auctioneer, a brisk man with a booming voice, stepped up to the podium and brought his heavy wooden gavel down. The bidding for the property opened at an aggressive $3 million. Dominique immediately raised her paddle. Her chin was tilted upward, projecting an entirely unearned confidence to the room of seasoned investors. 3.5 million, an investor called out from the left side of the room. Dominique raised her paddle again, her voice shaking slightly. 4 million. The auctioneer nodded. 4 million to the lady in the center. Do I hear 4.5? Mr. Sterling, sitting calmly in the front row, raised his proxy paddle. $5 million. Dominique whipped her head around, glaring at the back of the proxy lawyer. She swallowed hard, gripping her paddle so tightly her acrylic nails looked ready to snap. She raised her hand one more time. 5.5 million. I could see the beads of sweat forming on her neck. That was her absolute ceiling. That was every single borrowed, begged, and stolen dollar she had managed to gather to save the last scrap of our completely fraudulent legacy. She looked around the silent ballroom, a triumphant, desperate smile starting to form on her lips. She thought she had won. She thought she had saved the Buckhead mansion. Mr. Sterling did not even hesitate. He raised his paddle high into the air. $8 million in cash closing immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the crowded ballroom. Dominique dropped her bidding paddle. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud. Her shoulders collapsed completely, her posture crumbling as the crushing weight of absolute defeat slammed into her. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she realized she was entirely out of options. $8 million going once, the auctioneer announced, scanning the quiet room. Going twice. Sold to the proxy representative in the front row. The heavy wooden gavel struck the podium with a loud final crack. The family estate was officially gone. The fortress of my childhood nightmares now belonged entirely to me. The crowd began to disperse, investors murmuring about the aggressive final bid. Dominique remained frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the empty podium. She looked like a ghost, a hollow shell of the golden child who had once mocked my state college degree and paraded her rented luxury cars around town. She was officially a woman without a home, without a husband, and without a single shred of social standing. I stepped out from the shadows of the back row. My heels clicked with a steady, rhythmic cadence against the hardwood aisle as I walked directly toward her. I held a crisp white envelope in my right hand. The document inside had been drafted and notarized by my legal team that very morning, contingent entirely on the success of my proxy bid. Dominique slowly lifted her face as she heard my footsteps approaching. Her bloodshot eyes widened in absolute shock as she recognized me. She looked from my tailored suit to Mr. Sterling, who had turned around to give me a respectful nod before packing his briefcase. The devastating realization washed over her face. She finally understood exactly who the anonymous proxy buyer really was. You, Dominique whispered, her voice cracking with raw disbelief. You bought the house. You spent $8 million just to take it from me. I spent $8 million to sanitize a toxic waste dump, I corrected her, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any sympathy. You do not belong in that house anymore, Dominique. In fact, you do not belong anywhere near my property. I stopped right in front of her chair. I held out the crisp white envelope, pushing it directly into her trembling hands. What exactly is this document? She choked out, looking down at the official seal. That is a formal, legally binding eviction notice. I announced, my words ringing with absolute authority over my completely ruined sister. Dominique stared down at the crisp white paper resting in her trembling hands. Her eyes darted back and forth across the heavily bolded legal text, desperately searching for a loophole that simply did not exist. The official seal of the Fulton County Magistrate stared back at her, confirming the absolute finality of her grim situation. She looked up at me, her chest heaving violently as she gasped for air. You cannot do this to me, Simone, Dominique whispered, her voice cracking as a fresh wave of panic washed over her features. This is my home. This is the house where we grew up. You cannot just buy it out from under me and throw me out onto the street. I have nowhere else to go. Chadwick's assets are completely frozen and my credit cards are entirely declined. I need this house to maintain my brand. Your brand is a fabricated illusion, Dominique. I replied, my tone as cold and unyielding as a solid block of ice. And this house ceased being your home the exact second the auctioneer brought his wooden gavel down. It is now private property owned entirely by my holding company. I am your new landlord and I am officially terminating your occupancy. Dominique crushed the eviction notice in her fist, her sorrow instantly transforming into a wild, feral rage. She jumped up from her chair, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of elite social etiquette. I am not leaving! Dominique screamed at the top of her lungs, causing the few remaining investors in the grand ballroom to turn and stare at her in absolute shock. You are just a jealous, vindictive little accountant trying to punish me because I was always the favorite child. You think you can use your husband's new money to bully me? I will squat in that house. I will lock the gates and refuse to leave. You will have to physically drag me out of there. I did not flinch. I simply adjusted my navy blue suit and looked at her with profound pity. If you want to play the victim and force a physical removal, I will gladly arrange that for you, I stated calmly, stepping slightly closer so she could fully hear the undeniable promise in my voice. I will personally hire an entire fleet of private security contractors to forcibly remove you from the premises. I will make sure the local news stations and all of your superficial influencer friends are parked right outside the front gates to broadcast your humiliating departure live on national television. Dominique froze, the threat of public humiliation instantly silencing her frantic screams. She knew I was not bluffing. She knew I possessed the financial resources to make her absolute worst nightmare a highly publicized reality. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. Dominique, I commanded with brutal precision. You will pack your cheap rings, rented designer dresses, and whatever dignity you have left and leave my property. If you leave a single piece of trash behind, or if you attempt to damage the estate in any way, I will aggressively sue you for destruction of private property. I will bury you under relentless litigation that you will never see the outside of a courtroom again. Dominique's lower lip trembled violently. The venomous fight completely drained out of her, leaving behind nothing but a broken, terrified woman. She reached out a shaking hand, attempting to grab my arm in a desperate plea for mercy. Please, Simone. Dominique sobbed, her tears ruining her expensive makeup. We are sisters. We share the exact same blood. You cannot just throw me out into the cold. I will pay you rent. I will do whatever you want. Please let me stay in the guest house. I cannot let the people in Buckhead know that I am completely broke. I looked down at her outstretched hand and took a very deliberate step backward. I refused to let her toxic touch contaminate my hard-earned peace. You should have thought about sisterhood before you strutted into my private dining room and tried to extort my husband for $17 million. I reminded her, my voice devoid of any warmth. You explicitly called my family socially unfit. You claimed that we were not elegant enough to exist in your elite circles. Well, Dominique, it turns out that socially unfit people do not get the privilege of living in multi-million-dollar luxury estates. They get evicted. I turned my back on my weeping sister, refusing to offer any comfort. I walked proudly out of the grand ballroom, my head held high, leaving Dominique sobbing loudly on the patterned carpet. Mr. Sterling fell into step beside me, securely carrying the legal documents transferring the Buckhead estate into my possession. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the commercial bank and out into the bright, warm Atlanta sunlight. The bustling city noises washed over me, but I felt an incredible sense of serene silence within my own mind. I had systematically dismantled the very last stronghold of my abusers. I had reclaimed the physical space where my childhood trauma had occurred, and I was going to completely erase their dark legacy. I walked confidently toward my black car. The driver quickly opened the rear door. I slid into the comfortable leather seat and let out a deeply satisfied breath. The victory was sweet, absolute, and entirely undeniable. Exactly 48 hours later, the strict deadline of the eviction notice officially expired. I did not delegate this specific task to an anonymous property manager. I wanted to witness the complete sanitation of my new property with my own eyes. I sat comfortably in the back of my idling black car, parked discreetly just outside the towering wrought iron gates of the Buckhead estate. The majestic manicured lawns looked exactly as they had when I was a terrified child, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Today the air was thick with undeniable consequences. Promptly at 9 o'clock in the morning, two large unmarked moving vans pulled up to the circular driveway, closely followed by three private security vehicles I had personally retained. Six heavily built security contractors stepped out, forming a highly intimidating perimeter around the grand front entrance. A few moments later, the massive wooden front doors swung open. Dominique emerged, and the sight was almost pathetic enough to evoke pity almost. Without Chadwick's stolen money or Carlton's fraudulent credit lines, she could not afford a professional moving service. She was forced to physically drag a pair of heavily scuffed, oversized suitcases out onto the pristine stone porch herself. She was struggling under the immense weight of her remaining belongings, her face flushed red with absolute exertion and profound humiliation. Several of her former wealthy neighbors, the very people she had spent years desperately trying to impress with her fabricated influencer lifestyle, had conveniently decided to walk their pedigree dogs at that exact moment. They stood on the opposite side of the street, openly whispering and pointing, as the former golden child of the Sterling family was forcibly supervised by armed guards. Dominique tried to maintain a shred of her old, haughty dignity, but one of the cheap zippers on her overstuffed suitcase violently burst open under the pressure. A tangled mess of heavily worn clothes, tangled hair extensions, and cheap costume jewelry spilled directly onto the driveway. She dropped to her knees, frantically shoving her belongings back into the broken bag, while weeping openly in front of the entire neighborhood. She eventually managed to drag her broken bags toward a waiting economy rideshare vehicle, a massive, humiliating downgrade from her repossessed Porsche. As the cheap sedan drove her away from the multi-million-dollar estate forever, the heavy wrought iron gate slowly swung shut behind her, locking her out of the elite world permanently. The physical manifestation of my childhood trauma had been completely cleansed. Just as the driver merged smoothly into the busy downtown traffic, my mobile phone began to vibrate violently inside my leather purse. I pulled the device out and glanced at the bright screen. It was an unknown number displaying a cheap, untraceable prepaid burner phone carrier. I hesitated for a brief second before pressing the green accept button and lifting the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I answered. "Simone, please do not hang up on me," a frail voice begged. It was Vivian. My mother sounded completely destitute, broken, and utterly terrified. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the ragged breathing from the other end. The bustling noise of downtown Atlanta faded into the background as I sat in the luxurious leather seat of my private car. I felt only cold curiosity about how far the Queen of Buckhead had finally fallen. "How did you get this number, Vivian?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "I memorized it years ago," Vivian sobbed. "Simone, please, you have to help me. The federal agents seized everything. They took my phone, my jewelry, and my handbag. I am calling you from a cheap cell phone I bought at a gas station. I am sitting on a stained mattress in a filthy motel off the highway. I do not have a single dollar. I cannot live like this. You have to let me come to your house." "You are never stepping foot on my property," I replied firmly. "You made your bed when you walked into that dining room and tried to extort my husband. Now you get to sleep on that stained motel mattress." "You cannot be this cruel," Vivian wailed. "Your father is sitting in a federal holding cell. His bail was denied because he is considered a massive flight risk. He is 70 years old. If he goes to a federal penitentiary, he will die behind bars. They are assigning him a public defender because we cannot afford a private attorney. You have millions of dollars. You have to hire him a proper legal defense team. He is your father. He is a federal criminal who stole from his own employees and tried to frame an innocent tech founder," I corrected her. "I will not spend a single penny of Terrence's hard-earned money to defend a man who tried to ruin his life. Carlton deserves to rot in a federal cell for what he did to those pensioners, and you deserve to be exactly where you are right now." Vivian gasped, shocked by my absolute refusal to capitulate to her guilt trip. Her manipulative tears shifted into a desperate, frantic anger. "You are a monster," Vivian spat, though her voice trembled. "We gave you life. We raised you in the absolute best neighborhoods. We paid for your clothes and your food. You owe us your basic survival. You cannot just abandon your own flesh and blood when they are facing total destruction. We are your family. I am your mother. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. It was the exact same tired script she had utilized my entire life. You were never a mother to me, Vivian, I stated calmly. You were a warden. You were a cruel, demanding supervisor who constantly punished me for failing to meet your ridiculous social standards. You only valued me when you thought my compliance could somehow elevate your status at the country club. The moment I chose a path that did not directly benefit your selfish vanity, you threw me out like absolute garbage. You did not check on me for 9 years. You ignored my existence until you saw an opportunity to steal from my husband. People make mistakes. Vivian pleaded, her tone shifting back to pathetic begging. I was blind to what was truly important, but I am begging you for a second chance. Please, Simone, I will sleep in your guest house. I will clean your floors. I will do whatever you want. Just do not leave me out here to die in poverty. I am not leaving you to die, I told her. I am leaving you to live the exact life you earned. But since you brought up the concept of family and second chances, I actually have some very important news to share with you. I leaned back against the plush leather seat, a profound sense of peace washing over my entire being. Next Thursday morning, Terrence and I are going to the county courthouse, I announced, making sure my voice carried crystal clear over the cellular connection. But we are not going there to attend your miserable bankruptcy hearings. We are going to family court. I am officially and legally adopting Aaliyah. A stunned, heavy silence fell over the burner phone. That is right. I continued, smiling at the thought of my beautiful, brilliant stepdaughter. The little girl you so viciously called extra baggage is going to become my permanent, legally bound daughter. She will share my name, she will share my home, and she will be the sole heir to everything Terrence and I build together. I am making her my absolute priority over anyone who happens to share my toxic DNA. You are choosing another woman's child over your own mother. Vivian choked out, her voice barely a hollow whisper. I am choosing a child who actually knows how to love unconditionally. I corrected her sharply. Aaliyah showed me more grace, respect, and genuine kindness in her first week with me than you managed to show me in 33 years. She is my family. Terrence is my family. The three of us are going to build a massive, beautiful, and completely peaceful life together, and you will never ever be a part of it. Simone, please, Vivian sobbed, her voice breaking into a frantic, breathless wail. You cannot just erase me. I have absolutely nothing left. Dominique will not even answer my calls. Chadwick is trying to testify against your father. I am entirely alone. Please just send me a few $1,000s. Just enough to get a small apartment. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. I listened to her pathetic cries, feeling the last remaining invisible chain that bound me to her finally snap and dissolve into dust. Enjoy the cheap motel, Vivian, I said coldly. I pulled the mobile phone away from my ear, pressed the bright red button to terminate the call, and immediately blocked the burner number forever. The silence of my car allowed me to process the finality of my decision. Blocking my mother's burner phone severed the last cord, tethering me to the Sterling family empire. I slipped the phone into my purse and instructed my driver to head toward the federal building in downtown Atlanta. Today was not about reflecting on the ruins of my family. Today was about securing the indictments that would lock them away for decades. Before we could fully commit to the dark, unforgiving halls of the federal criminal courts, we had a much more sacred appointment to attend. Thursday morning arrived, bathed in brilliant golden sunlight. Terrence, Alia, and I walked hand in hand into the Fulton County Family Court, a building that felt infinitely warmer and more hopeful than any commercial bank or private dining room. We were escorted into the private chambers of a kind, soft-spoken family judge. The room smelled of old paper and polished cedar wood. Aaliyah sat between Terrence and me, wearing a beautiful floral dress, her dark eyes shining with an unmistakable, overwhelming joy. The judge reviewed the extensive legal paperwork confirming that Aaliyah's biological mother's rights had been legally terminated years ago, following her tragic passing, leaving the path entirely clear. The judge looked down from his bench, offering us a remarkably warm smile. Alia, the judge said gently, are you absolutely certain you want Simone to be your legally recognized mother? Aaliyah did not hesitate for a single microsecond. She reached out, grasping my hand with incredible strength. Yes, Your Honor. She has been my real mom since the day I met her. I want her name. Tears of pure, unadulterated happiness spilled over my eyelashes as the judge brought his wooden gavel down with a soft, definitive tap. The sharp sound was the exact opposite of the auctioneer's gavel. It did not symbolize destruction or ruin, but the permanent creation of a beautiful new life. I signed the official decrees with a gold pen, legally binding my heart to the brilliant, resilient teenager sitting beside me. She was no longer just my stepdaughter. She was Aaliyah Vance, the undisputed heir to our empire and the absolute center of my universe. The toxic bloodline of the Sterling family ended with me replaced entirely by a legacy built on genuine love, mutual respect, and unshakable loyalty. Only after securing our family's beautiful future did we finally turn our attention back to finishing off the ghosts of my past. Terrence was waiting for me on the steps of the federal courthouse. He wore a sharp suit, looking like the untouchable billionaire tech founder. He reached out, giving my fingers a warm, reassuring squeeze. We bypassed security with the assistance of Marcus Vance, our corporate attorney, who guided us straight to the top floor. We were ushered into a bright conference room overlooking the bustling city skyline. Two federal prosecutors sat waiting for us, flanked by Special Agent Hayes, the FBI investigator, who orchestrated the sting operation at the restaurant. The prosecutors looked highly satisfied, their briefcases overflowing with hard, undeniable evidence. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Vance." The lead prosecutor began motioning for us to take our seats at the long metal table. "I want to personally thank you for your unprecedented cooperation. Your video recording of the extortion attempt provided our task force with an airtight foundation. However, the landscape of this federal investigation shifted massively late last night." I leaned forward, crossing my arms over the polished table. "What changed?" I asked, eager to hear how the mighty had fallen further. Special Agent Hayes offered a grim, amused smile. "It turns out your brother-in-law possesses zero loyalty to his father-in-law," the agent stated bluntly. "Chadwick requested an emergency meeting with our federal prosecutors at 2 o'clock this morning. He was terrified of facing the maximum 35-year sentence for his role in the extortion plot and the subsequent wire fraud. So he decided to completely turn state's evidence. Chadwick is seeking a plea deal, and he brought us a goldmine of corporate corruption to guarantee his survival." Terrence let out a low, appreciative chuckle. "Chadwick threw Carlton right under the bus." "He did not just throw him under the bus," Marcus Vance interjected, pulling a fresh transcript from his leather briefcase. "Chadwick backed up and ran over Carlton repeatedly. To save his own skin, Chadwick voluntarily handed over 5 years of highly classified financial ledgers, encrypted emails, and secret offshore bank routing numbers. He thoroughly documented every single illegal transaction your father ever authorized." The lead prosecutor slid a thick, heavily redacted document across the metal table. "Chadwick revealed that the $7 million pension fund embezzlement was not an isolated incident of desperate panic," the prosecutor explained, tapping the paper. "According to the sworn testimony and the digital evidence Chadwick provided, Carlton Sterling has been systematically bleeding his own logistics company dry for over 2 decades. Your father has been running a massive, sophisticated shadow ledger. He skimmed millions of dollars from federal shipping contracts to artificially fund his lavish Buckhead lifestyle and maintain his elite social status. The sheer scale of my father's prolonged deception was staggering. He had spent my entire life lecturing me about hard work, discipline, and corporate integrity. He had violently judged Terrence for being poor, acting as though the sterling wealth was the righteous byproduct of superior intellect. In reality, Carlton was nothing but a corrupt thief stealing from his own hardworking employees to buy his country club memberships. Chadwick gave us everything we needed to guarantee a conviction." Agent Hayes continued, looking satisfied with the implosion of the criminal network. He detailed exactly how Carlton used dummy corporations to hide the stolen federal funds. He provided the names of the corrupt accountants who helped forge the quarterly reports. Chadwick essentially traded his father-in-law's entire existence for a reduced sentence in a minimum security facility. Will the plea deal be accepted? Terrence asked, his dark eyes focused intently on the federal prosecutor. We are finalizing the terms this afternoon. The prosecutor confirmed, adjusting his tie. Chadwick will serve 5 years, and he will be permanently stripped of all his real estate licenses and remaining assets. But because of his cooperation, Carlton is facing a mountain of insurmountable federal charges. Your father is looking at a minimum of 50 years in federal prison. He will never take another breath as a free man. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the absolute finality of their destruction. The cowardly betrayal between the two men was the most fitting conclusion to their pathetic story. They had built their fragile alliance on greed and racial superiority, and the very second they faced real consequences, they viciously tore each other to pieces. There is one more thing you should know, Marcus Vance said, checking his smartphone screen. When a high-profile federal informant provides this level of catastrophic corporate evidence, the court filings must be officially unsealed. Those documents became public record exactly 10 minutes ago. The press has already mobilized. I looked out the massive glass window of the federal conference room, gazing down at the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta, far below. The inevitable media storm was about to hit, and it was going to be spectacular. When we walked out of the federal building, our smartphones were buzzing relentlessly with breaking news alerts. Every financial publication, television station, and society blog was broadcasting the explosive story. The headlines were exceptionally brutal and unforgiving. They painted a horrifying picture of a disgraced corporate titan who robbed his own employees to fund a fake, luxurious lifestyle. The detailed reports featured direct quotes from Chadwick's damning confession, exposing the corrupt underbelly of the so-called untouchable Sterling family empire. Reporters were swarming the locked gates of the foreclosed Buckhead estate, broadcasting the ultimate downfall of Atlanta's most arrogant patriarch. The legacy of Carlton Sterling was destroyed in the press. 6 months after the media explosion completely dismantled my family's fraudulent empire, I sat in the front row of a heavily guarded federal courtroom. The polished mahogany walls of the United States District Court felt appropriately solemn for the monumental sentencing hearing taking place. Terrence sat right beside me, holding my hand firmly, as we watched the final act of this catastrophic tragedy unfold. The federal judge, a stern woman with absolutely zero tolerance for white-collar criminals, stared down from her elevated bench. Carlton stood before her, flanked by 2 exhausted public defenders. My father looked like a completely different man. The impeccably tailored suits and arrogant posture that had defined his entire existence in Buckhead were permanently gone. He wore a standard-issue orange prison jumpsuit, his shoulders slumped, and his hands trembling violently. The judge did not mince her words. She methodically listed his extensive crimes, highlighting the despicable embezzlement of employee pension funds and the malicious attempt to manipulate federal stock markets. She looked directly into my father's eyes and delivered the crushing blow. Carlton Sterling was officially sentenced to 45 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his shackled hands as the heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block. He would never breathe free air again. The sheer magnitude of his punishment was entirely justified. The hardworking employees whose retirements he had callously stolen were sitting in the very same courtroom, watching him face the ultimate, undeniable consequences of his unbridled greed and arrogance. Next came the sentencing phase for my treacherous brother-in-law. Chadwick stepped up to the defense, looking pathetically eager to receive the leniency he had negotiated through his cowardly betrayal. He had traded his father-in-law's freedom for his own survival, but the federal justice system still demanded its pound of flesh. The judge acknowledged his extensive cooperation with the prosecution, which ultimately saved him from spending decades behind bars alongside Carlton. However, she made it abundantly clear that his fraudulent real estate Ponzi scheme had ruined countless innocent lives. Chadwick was sentenced to 7 years in a minimum security federal correctional facility. But the prison sentence was only a fraction of his punishment. The judge explicitly ordered the immediate permanent revocation of his commercial and residential real estate licenses. Furthermore, she authorized the complete seizure and liquidation of every single remaining asset attached to his name. Chadwick was stripped of his bank accounts, his luxury vehicles, and his entire inheritance. He walked into that courtroom, believing his generational privilege would somehow shield him from absolute ruin, but he walked out as a completely penniless convicted felon. The arrogant white developer who had once demanded a $5 million consulting fee from my husband was now crying audibly as federal marshals escorted him out of the room. He had gambled his entire existence on a massive illegal deception, foolishly thinking his elite status made him immune to prosecution. The federal government proved him spectacularly wrong, ensuring he would spend the rest of his miserable life paying back every single stolen penny. As the heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind Chadwick, my gaze shifted upward toward the public viewing gallery. Sitting entirely alone in the very back row was Dominique. The sight of my older sister was genuinely jarring. The golden child who used to strut through exclusive country clubs in custom designer gowns and flawless diamond jewelry was completely unrecognizable. Dominique wore a faded, cheap gray sweater and poorly fitting denim jeans that looked like they came from a discount thrift store. Her signature hair extensions were gone, replaced by a messy, unstyled bun. The heavy dark circles under her eyes told the story of a woman who had lost absolutely everything. Her social media influencer empire had evaporated the moment her husband's financial crimes became public knowledge. Her wealthy friends had instantly blocked her number, treating her like a highly contagious disease. She had no home, no money, and no social status left to weaponize against the world. Dominique looked down at me from the gallery, her eyes hollow and completely devoid of the toxic superiority that had once defined her entire personality. She did not glare and she did not try to speak. She simply looked away, shrinking back into the dark shadows of the courtroom, an entirely broken and thoroughly defeated woman. She was finally forced to endure the brutal, unforgiving reality she deserved. The bailiff formally dismissed the court and the gallery began to empty. I did not look up at Dominique again. Nor did I spare a single glance backward toward the holding cells where my father was being processed for his permanent transfer. The heavy chains of my childhood trauma had been completely severed by the sharp blade of federal justice. Terrence stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket, and offered me his arm. I smiled, taking it gladly, and we walked smoothly down the center aisle of the quiet courtroom. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the bright, warm Atlanta sunlight. A massive crowd of reporters and news cameras waited at the bottom of the concrete steps, eager to capture a statement from the billionaire tech founder and the forensic accountant who had famously brought down a corrupt dynasty. But we did not stop to give them a single quote. We did not need to gloat or seek any public validation for our massive victory. Terrence guided me toward our waiting black car, the driver holding the door open for us. We slid into the comfortable leather seats, leaving the media circus and the toxic wreckage of my biological family far behind us. The dark, suffocating chapter of my painful past was officially closed. We were finally walking away toward a beautifully bright, unburdened future, ready to embrace the spectacular life we had built together, free from their poisonous influence.